Order, order. Welcome to this oral evidence session of the Education Select Committee. Can I welcome our witnesses and members to the session this morning. This is the second of two evidence sessions in public that the Select Committee is taking on the subject of historical forced adoptions. This morning we will be hearing from people with lived experience of historical forced adoptions, both as mothers and as adults who were adopted as babies. I want to acknowledge at the start of this session how traumatic and emotional this subject matter is. I want to say a particular thanks to our witnesses. I know that many of you have been campaigning for an apology for the experiences that you were subjected to over many years. I want to acknowledge that it is a difficult and exhausting thing to give your evidence again and again and to talk about your experiences, and we are enormously grateful to you for doing that today. I want to also acknowledge that the subject matter we'll be discussing today, I know will be triggering for people with personal experience of the systems and policies that we're talking about. Please look after yourselves as we go through the evidence session today. And I said to the witnesses privately before we began the broadcast, if they need to take a break, we will do that during this session. I want to do everything possible to make sure that the witnesses are well supported to be able to give their important evidence to us today. Thank you again for being here. Can I ask each of the witnesses, first of all, just to introduce yourselves to us? I might start with Diana, if that's okay.
I'm Diana Defries. I'm the chair of the Movement for an Adoption Apology, a campaign group that is run entirely by volunteers with lived experience. And we've been campaigning on this subject since 2010, but actually the people who founded it have been campaigning a lot longer.
Thank you very much.
I'm Lloyd. I joined MAR by accident, reading about it in a Sunday Observer on my way to speak at Manchester. And I couldn't believe that there was an organisation that was looking for an apology. And immediately I got into the hotel. I rang the organiser, who sadly has died, the founder, and I just could not believe that I was part of a group that was like me. Thank you.
Thank you. Sally.
I'm Sally Ells. I was born and adopted in the UK in 1967. I'm a survivor of historic forced adoption, and I live with its lifelong consequences. I'm also a co-founder of the UK Adoptee movement, and I campaign for an honest account of adoption history and for mitigation for the harm done.
You, Debbie.
I'm Debbie Iromlou, and I'm a co-founder of the Adult Adoptee movement. I was born in 1968, the year of the highest recorded adoptions on record in London. I'm a transracial adoptee and inter-country adoptee.
Thank you very much. So my first question is for Diana and Anne. Can you share with us your personal experience of the adoption system, as much as you would like to, of your personal experience, and how those experiences have shaped your lives subsequently?
Well, I didn't consent to the sex, but I found myself pregnant at 17. My first experience, actually, in 1966. And I was terrified when I discovered I was pregnant, because I knew the consequences it would leave with my very proud working class parents, who only wanted the best for me. And I had let them down. And they told me without any hesitation that I had let them down and brought shame onto the family, and I had to be sent away. In other words, this was for the best, because that's a phrase that's constantly used. It will be for the best. For the best for my parents, because they hid me away, as they thought, and the best for the baby that is yet to be born. because I would not be able to keep the baby. So you could also say it started with my parents. If they'd have said something different to me, like, it's okay, we'll look after you and you can keep the baby, I wouldn't be sitting here today, but that was not what happened. And the shame has stayed with me. I still have it. I was sent away to, first of all, a friend of the family. A friend of the family who was very highly regarded, actually, when everybody had left the house, sexually abused me. But he said to me, nobody will believe you, Anne, because you're a bad girl. You're a really bad girl, and nobody will believe this. So I didn't tell anybody until actually my son returned 27 years later, when I had a conversation with my mum. She didn't believe me. So he was right, because he couldn't possibly have done that, because he's a very respectable man, unlike me, who wasn't respectable. So, in a way, when I went to the home, it was my role, and it was like a punishment. The whole time I was there was to scrub steps from morning and to the evening. When I got to the bottom, I was told to go back to the top and do them again. I eventually went into labour, which I was dreading because I was frightened of what would happen, dreading I really wanted my family, and dreading it because I would lose the baby. And he was my best friend. I didn't know it was a he at the time, because that was what was keeping me going. When I went into labour, into the hospital, I was given nothing for pain, because I was told, I will remember the pain because you've been a bad girl. I had an episiotomy, and I was stitched without any local anaesthetic. Every time I moved, the doctor slapped my leg. This was an NHS hospital in 1967 by then, January 1967. I then gave birth. I asked, could I see him? They said no. He's for adoption. No, you can't. In other words, you're not a fit person to see this baby. All I was unmarried. But then it continued, and I caught the eye of what I thought was a kind-looking nurse, midwife. And I asked her, and she said, oh, Anne, I can't, but I'll go away and see. And she came back and she said, you can have him for 10 days, but don't get too close. Well, I'd taken his armband off him. I'd taken the sign on the, the lettering on the cot. I took all sorts of memorabilia in a way, and they must have seen me do that. And so they decided to move him. I went to the nursery, and on the 8th day, he wasn't there. And the midwife, and I'll never, ever forget her face, because she also had lipstick on her tooth, and those of us who wear lipstick will know sometimes you catch it on your tooth. But whenever I see that, I freeze, because she said, oh no, he's not here, he's over there. He's in that room waiting for his new mummy, and you'll never see him again. You come with me. And she put me into a bath, salt bath, and grabbed my breast and said, you won't need this milk, I'll get rid of it now. I never felt more worthless in my life. And I didn't have any fight in me. I'm a campaigner, of course, but I didn't have any fight. But I was only a certain age, and just 18 in the November, as this happened in the January. So I then go home and nobody mentions it. It's never to be discussed. So I lost the baby. It was taken from me. I didn't give him up, which lots of times they write about me, as you all know what I used to do. They write and they say, she gave him up for adoption. I didn't. The state took him. And that's the briefest I could be to give you an outline of the story.
Thank you very much for sharing that. It's really important. Diana.
So I found that I was pregnant in 1974. I thought I was in a relationship. I thought I was with someone who was, interested in me, cared about me. Turned out that wasn't true. So when I was brave enough to say, I think this might be the situation, he just said, well, that's it then, and left me. I was very afraid. I didn't have a good relationship at home. I didn't have anyone I could confide in at school or anywhere. So I didn't tell anyone. And my parents finally noticed when I was about 7.5 months pregnant, because I had so much back pain, I was dragging one leg. And they took me to see someone who gave me a very cursory examination and said, wait here. He spoke to my parents, didn't speak to me. When we went home, they said, in his professional opinion, he thinks you're pregnant. And I took that as an opportunity to say yes and help. And all hell broke loose. And from there, they took me to a GP who treated me as if I was about 6 years old. I hear you've been a naughty girl, he said. And then he spent the rest of the time conversing with my mother. Arrangements were obviously made at some point. I was never consulted. No one ever said, what do you want? How do you want to deal with this? No one ever actually said, how do you feel? And I was terrified. And, when you're young and you're vulnerable and you have no resources and everybody around you turns against you, it's horrifying. It's really difficult. I was sent away to Southampton, to a home there, called Nazareth House, and the irony didn't strike me for years, actually, about the name. I wasn't there so long because it was very late in the pregnancy. They treated us as if we were a bit simple, I suppose is a kind way to put it. We were always spoken down to. We were always treated as if we were not quite there. We lacked mental capacity. And everybody there was perfectly normal, just pregnant and unmarried. I was sent to give birth in an NHS hospital, and the treatment there was equally bad. Nobody spoke to me. I believe I was given gas and air, but it certainly wasn't enough. I wasn't allowed to sit up or move around. They put me in a delivery room and they held me down. And it was extremely difficult because you need gravity to help you deliver, really. And every time I tried to sit up, this woman, nurse, I think, held my shoulders. And I was given an episiotomy without really understanding what it was. And it was a tremendous shock. And that whole experience kind of takes the fight out of you. When you know people hold that power over you physically, and you know that people have that much control over your well-being, potentially your life, it's very difficult to fight back. When my daughter was born, they took her away, and I begged them to bring her back. And this nurse brought her back through the door, past my feet, and put her at the far side of what was a very large room. And I couldn't reach her. I had stitches without anaesthesia, and nobody spoke to me. And then they all left me there. And I was in that room for about 4 hours, I know, because there was a clock on the wall. And my baby was crying, and I couldn't get to her. And for the first 2 hours I was calling out and sort of saying, I'm here, it's okay. I felt so weak I couldn't climb off it. It felt very high up, whatever I was lying on. And I just had a sheet. I was thirsty, I was hungry, I was exhausted. After 4 hours, I'd completely lost my voice. My baby had stopped crying. I thought she might have died. I didn't know. And then a woman came in and said, I didn't know there was anyone in this room. So then there's a blank. And at no point did anyone ever say to me, are you okay? Do you need anything? They never really sort of considered my welfare. After a couple of days from being in a little room, I was moved to the ward. Thank you. I was moved to a ward, which was like torment because everybody else had cards and flowers and happy families and congratulations. And I was this little arid patch in all the joy. And they kept saying to me, you mustn't pick your baby up, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. And as soon as I had any milk available, somebody appeared and said, you're obviously in pain, do you want something for the pain? And I thought he meant some kind of analgesic. I didn't even know that word then. And I just said, well, okay. And he gave me an injection, and that dried up the milk. So that wasn't exactly what I would call a consensual process. I was taken back to London after 12 days. I was taken back to the mother and baby home, then 12 days later to London, to the adoption agency. And on the journey back was the longest I held my daughter. It was 2 hours. And it was like everything suddenly made sense. And I just felt like this was absolutely right. And I wouldn't let go of her. And I held her all the way to the agency. And we stood in reception. And the woman appeared and said, it's time. And then my mother just looked at me and I shook my head. I said no. And she was just taken from my arms and handed over. And she howled. I assume I did, I don't know. And the following week they sent me back to school. And that's kind of a bit too much detail, I suppose, but there we are.
Too much detail. Thank you very much for sharing with us. Can I turn now, Sally and Debbie, could you tell us about your experience as adults who were in many ways on the other side of that story as babies who were adopted and the consequences that has resulted in for your lives? Perhaps starting with Sally.
Well, forced adoption has shaped my entire life. It's had a profound and traumatic impact on me, and it still does now. So the trauma that it's caused and with the identity erasure has caused me lifelong harms. My earliest memory is terror. I remember the explicit and the implicit messages were that I was unwanted, and I had an immense fear of rejection that has never actually left. So it started really early in childhood. So every adoptee's experience is individual, but there are 4 core themes that tend to emerge from the collective testimony and are my experience. So the first one of those is trauma and loss of identity. The second one is stigma and unwantedness. The third one is serving the adopter. And the fourth one is the lifelong health impact. So the first theme, trauma, erasure of identity and alienation, for me, being separated at that point when attachment should have been forming and identity and safety should have been forming, there was a loss there, but that loss was never acknowledged. We weren't allowed to express it. We had to bury it and get on with our lives. So forced adoption stripped me of my identity. I had my name changed. I had no family information. I had no medical information. And I grew up with people who didn't mirror me physically or otherwise. And I felt alien throughout my childhood. And again, that's a feeling that persists. Debbie will talk about transracial and international adoptees, but being raised by exclusively white parents, that further compounded the harm and added additional deeper identity wounds and trauma and disconnection from heritage. And there were also late discovery adoptees, not told they were adopted until later childhood or older. And there's additional psychological betrayal and additional profound trauma for them. For me and many adoptees, discovering as adults that we were wanted by our mothers and families was actually devastatingly destabilising. It was a real shock. I couldn't believe it when I met my family that actually they did want me. They looked like me, they sounded like me, they had the same sense of humour as me, and I realised I wasn't alien anymore. But I was in my early 50s when I finally plucked up the courage to do that, because I'd been told I was unwanted. And I'd been told I came from a bad family, from a bad place. The second theme is stigma and unwantedness. So I grew up stigmatised, labelled, so phrases like illegitimate, bad blood, and I was really terrified about what I might grow into. I internalised that narrative that I was unwanted and should be grateful, and it has shaped my life. And the third theme is serving the adopter, not the child. So adoptive parents were positioned as saviours. They were rescuing us from unfit mothers, and we were very clear that that was the case. And we were aware that, and I was aware that I was a solution for my adoptive parents. So I was the solution to infertility. Some other adoptees were solutions to child death. And that comes with a sense of being second best. You weren't what was wanted, but you were what was settled for. We were required to meet all those adult emotional needs. I learnt to suppress any distress I felt, to disassociate really from what I felt about pretty much anything, and mask to try to fit in. For transracial and transnational adoptees, they were expected to assimilate into families and cultures not their own, and they had to endure the racial naivety of white adopters. So there was no safeguarding, nobody came to check on us, and neglect and abuse in adoptive families was common. The fourth theme is lifelong impact. So we experience serious mental health impacts, particularly high diagnosis rates of complex PTSD, and I'm one of those statistics. We have high physical health linked to chronic stress, including autoimmune disorders, gastrointestinal conditions, and early death. Some of us have siblings who haven't made it, adoptive siblings, and that's partly why we're here. There's increased suicide risk, and there's overrepresentation in addiction, homelessness and prisons. So we are denied our family medical history and appropriate care. Some adoptees discover too late that they've got inherited conditions. And I'd just like to say it's not a historic harm. It continues across my life and across the lives of many, many adult adoptees.
Thank you, Sally. Debbie?
My birth mother came here. She went to a Harley Street clinic. She asked for help. So she didn't come from a working class background. She came from quite a high class family. Her doctor put her in touch with the Phyllis Holman Richards Adoption Society, which didn't effectively register as adoption agency until the year after I was born in 1969. They placed me in an unsuitable home. Local authorities had warned them that my foster mother, soon to be adoptive mother, was not fit to take children in. They ignored those recommendations, and I was left there anyway. When I was placed in that home, local authorities were visiting and checking on me, but they still didn't see fit to remove me from the home. I was raised by a single woman who was suffering with her own mental health issues. She raised me to believe that I was her biological daughter and that I was mixed race. and I believed her. Although I felt that something wasn't quite right and she wouldn't answer any questions that I had about my background honestly. So when my official adoption, during that time I was placed in foster care, I see that I was seen as a problem case, possibly because of my international roots and parentage. And I feel that I wasn't cared for and given the family life that I was supposed to have been given. When I discovered about my adoption at the age of 16, I was then told that I had no right to know anything about my biological parents and who I was and where I came from. My adoptive mother said that my birth mother wanted to abort me, but she couldn't. And I was told many awful things about her. And the local authority, during the time that they had visited me before my adoption order was made, knew that I was being deceived about my origins, as well as that I was in an unsuitable home, but did nothing to protect me. I was offered no counselling or support, and the shock of suddenly discovering the truth about who I was sent me into a spiral. I went to the agency and they refused to show me any file and told me that my birth mother's life would be in danger if I tried to search for her. Over a period of 4 decades, I've been trying to attempt to access my file, and on each occasion over those 4 decades, I'm given 1 more piece of paper or 2 more pieces of paper, but I've never physically been shown any file. The most degrading part was 10 years ago when I sat in an office with a social worker who had her file, my file on the table in front of her, and she turned the pages and she wouldn't let me physically hold it or look myself, and she decided what should be photocopied and what shouldn't be photocopied. I've now once again tried to contact the agency that's holding my file because the original agency has closed down, and in those 40 years my file has ended up in various different agencies and different warehouses over time. I've now been told I have to wait 2 years to get a social worker to find my file, redact information that they see fit that I'm not allowed to view myself, and then I'll be able to access it. The lifelong impact for me is growing up as a transracial adoptee in a white small community, which many of us did during those years, with no access to any racial mirroring or role models whatsoever. Also, my biological background was Middle Eastern, so I was raised with racist views towards my own biological family and my own people. And that's had a massive impact on my life. Trying to assimilate within my own culture, to learn my own language, to be accepted in my own community has proved really difficult for me. I've also been diagnosed in 2021 with complex post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the discovery of my adoption and the abuse that I went through as a child.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think it's important just to reflect both on the power and of the evidence that you've given us in describing your experiences, all of you, but also that those experiences were obviously unique and personal to you, but typical of others who were in that same system that we're talking about today at the same time. And we are once again immensely grateful to you for sharing with such clarity and detail what happened to you. We're going to move to some more detailed questions now, and I'm going to start with Serena.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to everyone for speaking so openly and honestly on your experiences and everything that the Chair has just made. My question is to Diana and Anne. We've heard as a committee previously that lots of evidence from many mothers that felt that they had no meaningful choice and that coercion was baked into the entire system. So can you tell us how the process of consent, how that was presented to you at the time, and what information or support were you given to help you understand your options? And I'll start with Diana.
The idea that we had the option to consent to anything is not based on reality. We didn't have any choice given to us. Throughout the whole process, and having had conversations with many other mothers, it was all about what was best for the baby. When I say best for the baby, what they would say is, if you love your baby, you'll give it to a proper family. You make sure it has a respectable upbringing, and it has all the things you, as a young, silly girl, couldn't possibly give it. And this attitude permeated right the way through until everything stopped, sort of mid-80s. It was always that attitude that we had no real, we had no right to agency, so therefore we weren't offered it. And the idea that we would consent or even be able to consider anything just doesn't really come up, certainly not in my experience and in the experience of many of the mothers that I've spoken to. The form it took was, you will sign these papers, you will do this, it's the best thing you can do, you'll put it behind you and get on with your life, which of course is an impossibility. But that was pretty much my take on the idea of consent.
Yeah. I can't remember ever signing anything, and I believe I've been told that I didn't. I didn't sign anything, so I didn't give consent. And the reason I'm saying this is BBC are doing a documentary on how young women were treated from the 50s, 60s, 70s. And they've found this in many instances, that there isn't anything that I signed, because the reality is the age of majority then was 21. And so I could not have necessarily signed it. But what I was constantly told was, your parents, that they can't look after the baby, you won't be allowed to have any money, which was a lie, because the welfare state was there for us. But I believed it wasn't for me. Where will you look after this baby? And you say you love this baby, well, let him go to a proper family who will love him better. He will have a better outcome. And I have a letter from the moral welfare worker, that's what they were called, moral welfare, to say, you must be so pleased to see the baby looking so well, and also you must be really pleased that you've done the right thing, because he will not grow up with the stigma of illegitimacy. So, in a way, that's what it was about. But it was about much more than that. There wasn't any consent. I was never discussed anything other than, this is what will happen.
Thank you. Manuela.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your powerful evidence. You all have campaigned tirelessly for a formal government apology. What difference would an apology from government make to you and to the wider community of mothers and adoptees affected by forced adoption? And I'll start with Anne.
It would mean the world, because I still blame myself. I still, you do a job that I used to do. The Daily Mail writes about me regularly, or they did, when they found out that I'd got a baby. And nobody was, I didn't have any children as far as everybody was concerned, which I didn't. And people would say, oh, I suppose you wanted a career rather than children, and without knowing what the circumstances were. But they always write, she gave him up for adoption. She gave him to be adopted. In other words, especially the Daily Mail, was vile to me. And the reason I want this apology is also to clear my name from that, but also for my son, because I didn't give him away. And my son didn't know he was adopted till he was 27 years old. So it sort of, I can't tell you how much it means, other than a government apology would help to set the record straight. It would help me to stop blaming myself. It would help me to heal, because I haven't. I still feel shame. Yeah.
A government apology would be an acknowledgement of the state's role in all of this. And that's really what we need. We need somebody to say sorry and to recognise the fact that there was all this machinery running in the background that allowed people like parents, like GPs, like adoption agencies to actually do what they did. Because it wouldn't have been possible had there not been this machinery in the background. So for the state to say, or for the government or a representative to say, we are sorry, and to mean it, that would be enormous for so many people. It would shift the blame, it would shift the shame, and it would lift the burden.
Well, an apology matters to us because the state harmed us and we're still living with the consequences. So it does matter enormously. For decades and decades, as Diana and Dan have said, the incorrect narrative has been that adoption saved children like me and that we should be grateful. And that narrative has harmed us, and it's wrong. And the truth is that we were forcibly separated from our mothers. We lost our identities, we lost our medical histories and our sense of belonging. And a meaningful apology would correct that harmful narrative. It would acknowledge that our adoptions were forced and that they caused harm, and that adult adoptees and mothers deserve redress. And that recognition matters to us hugely. It will reduce our shame. It allows adoptees like me to seek trauma-informed support with some dignity, helping make that support more effective. And hopefully you'll come on to the, but words are not alone are not enough.
We'll come on to that.
Abby.
An apology is important to me because the state were involved in my adoption. An agency was involved in my adoption, and the lifelong impact that's created in me of not being given a stable family home environment, of being placed in an unsuitable home, of being overlooked, of being made to feel such shame about asking questions as to why. I mean, that was it really for me. Why? And nobody gave me those answers. So an apology would mean that the state has admitted wrongdoing, and it would ease the shame that I carry for asking why.
Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just say thank you for your very powerful testimony. Many survivors have said that it's important that an apology is given urgently. So perhaps you could tell us why the timeliness of this is so important, and what the consequences would be if the government delayed giving an apology. And maybe I'll start with Diana.
The consequences are severe. We've already lost people. The issue is that we're an ageing cohort, particularly the mothers, but also the adoptees. Sometimes I've met adoptees who are older than me, and that sort of shakes me to the core, because I start to realise just how far-reaching and how long this has been going on. And when you think about it in that context, it starts to become really worrying that there have been as many delays as there have, because so many people are at a point in life where they're no longer coherent, they're no longer functioning. There are women I know who were hale and hearty when I first got involved, and they're now in homes or confined to their home because they're not able to navigate the world at large. So the importance is the passage of time and how we are all ageing, and we're very concerned about the delays that have happened thus far.
Yeah, I would agree. We're dying, as one of our posters say, dying for an apology, because we are dying. The founder of this organisation died 2 years ago, and she was a really fighter, but she won't be able to see this. Why is it urgent? Because everything that has just been said, but also because there's still a stigma about women. We still get blamed. I didn't get myself pregnant. And, you know, we've got a government today that says it wants to support women and girls and abuse, but they could do it by starting with this apology. They could really make a difference to our lives, and that's so important.
Well, it's urgent, and I think the community, well, personally, and the community of survivors, I think there's huge frustration because I'm 59, and I was born in 67, the year before Debbie, when the peak hit, and we've been raising this, asking about this for so long, and yeah, we kind of don't know what else do we have to say. How many times do we have to go over our stories?
You shouldn't have to keep coming
kindly
here
recognise that
repeating
at the
your
start.
story.
But it is it's harrowing to go over it again and
absolutely.
again and again. It's not something we do for the love of it or for any reason. We'd like to disappear and just get on with our lives. So we're ageing, as Anne and Diane have said, you know, we are ageing as well. The adoptees are ageing, and many of us have already died without hearing the state say, this should not have happened to you. That's all we want people to say. Yeah. It was wrong, what happened to you. And the longer we wait, the longer the shame continues, and the longer that injury endures. And we need people to recognise it was wrong, so that we can have some actions that actually make a difference and help us.
Thank you. Debbie, anything you'd like to add?
I'd like to reiterate everything really that Sally's already said, and the others, that it would reduce the shame. We are an ageing community. Many from the adult adoptee community have taken their own lives as a result of their adoptions. It will acknowledge the harm that was done to us as a community of survivors, because that's how we see ourselves, as survivors, and it will give us some redress as well.
Thank you. Peter.
So much, all of you, for coming here today and sharing your testimonies. I think both of your organisations have spoken about the importance of co-authoring an apology with the government. Can I ask what that would look like for you, and perhaps start with Sally, if that's all right?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this among the community a lot because it matters to people. So I think before an apology, the government needs to work with those of us with lived experience, the lived experience-led organisations, with adoptees and with mothers, to actually co-author that apology and define the mitigations. And then during the apology, it needs to be public and formal, with survivors invited, made at the highest level. The government needs to accept state responsibility for the harm that's been caused, and the government must include mitigations to redress some of that harm. And then after the apology, we think 5 mitigations need to be delivered. 1 is records access, 2 is trauma-informed mental and physical health support, 3 is effective tracing and intermediary services. Debbie spoke very powerfully about that. 4 is research into adult adoptee outcomes, because we know bad things have happened to us. Debbie mentioned the increased suicide risk, but it's still happening to adoptees, and unless you know what the problems are, you can't solve them. And 5 is independent and meaningful representation of adult adoptees in adoption policy and practice making. We've got a unique lived experience that enables us to look at what's happening today and think, well, if only that could happen, that would have such a helpful impact. And adult adoptee-led and mother-led organisations need to lead on overseeing how those mitigations are implemented.
Sally, just to say, I think we're going to come on to those mitigations in a bit, but Dana, if I can sort of turn to you and your view on what a co-authored apology would look like.
I would echo what Sally has said, simply because the detail that she's given you pretty well covers most of it. The concern that we have is that other apologies have been made in other nations, shall we say, and promises were made and broken. So what we're anxious to do is not only be part of the co-authoring process and make sure that the apology hits where it's meant to, which is to make people feel like they've been seen, heard and validated, but also that anything that is agreed by way of mitigation or remedy or reparation, to make sure that there is actually follow through. Because the concern that has been expressed privately, and I'm just taking this opportunity to express it publicly, is that in other nations this has taken place, there has been an apology, everyone's been appreciative, and then there's been no follow-up, no follow-through. And if we lose that, then the apology becomes meaningless. So the co-authoring needs to be the apology, and as Sally so wisely said, the measures that follow. Because we need to make sure that people receive the help that they need.
Thank you. We'll go to Mark.
Thank you, Chair. To be honest, I think that Sally and Dana have comprehensively answered my question about the process. So all I'll say is thank you so much for your evidence today, and we'll absolutely take this forward before handing over to Serena.
Have anything to add?
Well, I just wanted to add that an acknowledgement of an apology is an important thing, but it's not enough to say sorry. It's more than sorry. It's the government needs to make implementation and action on changes to the system for us to be able to access our records without delay.
Did you want to say anything on?
Yes, I think the Joint Committee on Human Rights, when the government of the day responded to that, they kept saying they were sorry that this had happened to us, but nothing else. And at the beginning of this campaign, which started, I think, in 2015-16, when a different government was in place, the lines that were to take in the letters were constantly saying, yes, but it doesn't happen now. Very sorry about what happened, but it doesn't happen now. Now, in some instances, it went later, and I know Diana has evidence of that. But the reality is that we were looked at as a certain type of person. Now, I have a friend who is a member of the organisation who had her first baby adopted through no fault of her own, but when she was married, been married for 7 years, she was pregnant again. The GP said to her, "Oh, we're really looking out for your sort of girl. Would you like this baby adopted as well?" Now, therefore, it's your sort of girl is still in the mentality of people, and it still is a bit today. And I think we need to really look at how we can support people, but give them proper support. And I believe you took evidence a couple of weeks ago stating that that's essential. And so I just want to add that to it, because we're not that sort of girl.
Thank you. And can I just say the scope is something that we're interested in, and we know that you've got some evidence about the continuation of the practice beyond the Adoption Act in 1976. I don't know if you wanted to say a little bit about that now, or we'd be obviously happy to take your evidence in writing about that as well.
The issue for me is that because people are constantly in touch with our campaign and they are keen to know whether we're making progress, if we're making progress. At the time of the inquiry in 2021-22, there were agonised emails that came in saying, I had my son or daughter taken in 1977, 78, 79. Am I not to be included in this? Mm. And somebody that I know quite well had her daughter taken in 1983. Mm. I have requested statements from 2 of those people, and I have sent them in as evidence. And my biggest concern is that this cut-off point of 76 is unjust. And there are a lot of people, because the issue is more that there were pre-retirement social workers who didn't really see the law change as being relevant to them, and they carried on with the same practices. So there were a lot of very young girls who had their children taken well after 76.
That's really helpful for us to understand. Thank you very much. We'll go to Serena.
Thank you. We'll now consider the points that you raised regarding the access to adoption records, and we're keen to hear about your experience with the process that we've heard previously that was described as traumatic and dehumanising. So what steps do you believe that the government and record holders should take? Debbie, I'll start off with you.
Well, firstly, what we're calling for is a centralised system of adoption records on one database. Ideally, what we would like to do is collate all adoption records into one location so it's easy to find, because what we are discovering now is, depending on where you live and depending on the year that your adoption took place, your records could be held in any number of locations, and sometimes multiple locations. So it's being able to have our records onto one database so we know where they are, and ideally in one location as well. And for those records to be accessed as quickly as possible. I mean, it's totally unacceptable that now the waiting list times are 2 years to access your records, and that's been confirmed by the Post-Adoption Centre. Once a social worker has accessed your file, they have to make redactions to those files. We also ask that no redactions are taking place. We understand where third-party information is seen as unnecessary for us to look at, but personally, sometimes these redactions can be so extreme that you're given one A4 size piece of paper with one sentence at the bottom that you can read, and the rest is all blacked out. And this is our past, this is our life, this is how we came into the world. And how I see it is, it's my human right. It's my basic human right to know who I am, where I came from, why I was left. If you want to...
It would just to complement that, and what we hear again and again, and what we've all experienced, is our records are held by social workers, they're held by churches, they're held by agencies, and when we go to them, we're treated as if the information about our own lives does not belong to us. Mm-hmm. It's theirs, it's not ours. Mm-hmm. And we're told our records are lost, and then often, if we persevere, that turns out to be false. And these are repeating stories again and again and again. And much of what relates to us, as Debbie says, is redacted. So we can't even see it when we do get something. And the process is so painfully slow. At the moment, we understand it's 12 to 18 months, 2 years, I think PAC UK are saying in some cases. And the other thing that happens when we try to access our records is we're often advised not to contact our birth families. We're told it will disrupt their lives. That's the phrase that gets used. And that loads us with more anxiety, more shame. We're troublesome again. We came from these unfit mothers, we're unfit children, and here we are being troublesome again.
I was just going to say, in the common narrative, that we should be grateful. We should be grateful, and we shouldn't be seeking our birth families, because if we're seeking our birth families, we're being ungrateful for it.
Yeah, so exactly as Debbie says, there's two essential, very practical steps that we think would make a huge difference. One is mandate a single online database listing where all the records are held. So we recognise it might be impractical to bring them all together, but the UK and Ireland, I think, Archives and Records Association have done a fabulous piece of work on this, and they've actually already developed this database. It's there. They just need some help getting it off the ground, and all that information's online, and that would make a huge difference to us. And the second one is having a clear service standard. So we'd like our request to be acknowledged within, say, 10 working days. We'd like the records provided within, say, 8 weeks or something. We'd like only third-party information to be redacted, and only with explanation so we know why. We'd like trauma-informed practice. We're often treated quite brutally. As Debbie says, it's this whole narrative. This goes back to the apology, and we still live with this narrative that you were lucky, you were saved, you should be grateful. And it comes through when we try and do anything related to our adoption. It comes through with records, and it comes through when we try and seek any sort of mental health support. And also, it would be good if there could be some accountability to an arbitration body, so they could say, well, are you providing the records within X period of time, and there could be some sort of oversight of it. So those are the practical things we'd like.
Manuela, do you?
Yeah, just very, very briefly. So, in your views, what safeguards or feature would be essential for this centralized digital database so that it works for mothers and adoptees?
It's exactly those things. We'd like there to be some sort of service standard for acknowledgement time, a service standard for when they're going to get back to us in a reasonable period of time when we're going to get our records. It's this redaction of only third-party information and only with explanation. It's being trauma-informed, so knowing that, you know, we've been harmed by this process, and we have every right. We should feel we should be treated with dignity, because often we're not. Mm-hmm. We're told to like we're children, mm-hmm. and we're told, oh, you're doing a bad thing getting these records. You're going to upset your adoptive families, and you're going to disrupt the lives of these people who gave you up and didn't want you. And it's painful. It's really painful. And yeah, some accountability so that there's some sort of oversight of those requirements.
You want to I appreciate the time, but I would be amiss if I didn't mention this or ask the committee and the chair a question. Do you know why we have to keep repeating our evidence? You acknowledged that at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Do you know if there is a problem with government giving an apology? Is there any information that we could have? Because we feel we've done everything possible that we can. We've cooperated, we've done so well from our point of view. Why are we having to continue with this campaign?
So I will say two things in response to that, Anne, and the first is that this committee is doing this work for precisely that reason, that we believe there is unfinished work as a consequence of the Joint Committee on Human Rights work, and we want to play our part in moving this forward from you. And I am sorry that you are here having to give your evidence again, particularly having been through an inquiry that I think many of us believed would get to that point of an apology, and then to find that it didn't. And the second thing is that in the second half of this session we will be hearing from the Minister, who I can see at the back of the public gallery listening very carefully to the evidence that you are giving, and we will put those questions to him as well.
Thank you, Helen, but I needed to say that. Thank you.
We'll go to Caroline now.
Thank you. So you've all spoken very powerfully about the lifelong trauma that you've all experienced because of what you've been through. So I'd just like to ask if you could give us a sort of brief assessment of what you think the availability is of current trauma-informed mental health pathways for adult adoptees and birth mothers. That might be a one-word answer, I think. And maybe also what steps you think could be taken to make post-adoption counselling more accessible and emotionally safe for both mothers and adoptees. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Diana?
I'll start. It is a very short answer. I'm not aware of any services that effectively provide for mothers. Equally, there are allegedly services for adoptees, but I will let them answer. But I have had conversations with people desperate to get help, deeply traumatised. Maybe they need support with reunion, maybe they need support with somebody in their family finding out what happened 50 years before and everything has fallen apart. And there is nothing I have been able to find, to the extent that I actually self-referred to local mental health services to just check out what was there a year ago. And it's still not really making progress. And this is, I'm in a good place now. I have not been in a good place in the past, so I kind of levered that to see what I could do. Yeah. Because I want to be able to give this information to other people. So far, I can honestly say I haven't been able to find anything by way of support service for people like us.
I would just agree with Diana. I've got nothing further to add. It's not there.
It's not there. Thank you. Lee.
Debbie can talk very personally about all of this. I'd say current provision is scarce and it's harmful. And I'm talking from personal experience. Yeah. So we're adoptees, we get sent down the wrong and harmful anxiety treatment pathways, and that increases our shame and our sense of guilt. And actually what we're feeling is a normal reaction to serious trauma. Yeah. We're not overly anxious. I've tried many times during my life to access support, and I get sent down these pathways and they're all about, we just need to think about it differently. Well, I was given up for adoption. It was forced by the state, and then I had a horrible childhood. I have got something to be anxious about. And being told, just repeat these affirmations and you'll be fine, it doesn't cut it. It really doesn't cut it. And it's very upsetting. And many clinicians and therapists at the moment, they don't recognise that we need trauma treatment. But I've had trauma treatment now. I happen to have had it, not because I went and spoke about my adoption experiences, but because my son had a life-threatening illness. And when I accessed it, what it uncovered was that I had all this trauma from my adoption. And dealing with that treatment, it's changed my life. But it's really sad that other adoptees don't have that. Yeah. So I think there's 4 things that could be done. The first, and they're very simple things, we're not talking about spending a lot of money. The first is fast-tracking adult adoptees and mothers into existing, and they do exist, trauma-informed pathways, like the pathways for veterans, to end all of those barriers and being turned away and given treatment that's incorrect. And the second thing that could be done is embed our needs into NICE guidelines. So we've got distinct needs for trauma, injury-informed care, and that needs to be codified. The third thing that could happen is ensure support is available across our lives, because the severance injury that we all live with, it's enduring, and many adoptees have experienced abuse. And finally, ensure funding for that kind of support only goes to safe organisations, and I can't emphasise that enough, independent from adoption, not those previously involved in adoption or upholding adoption now.
The provision for counselling support is scarce, non-existent. The Post-Adoption Centre offer counselling services for adult adoptees, but that's reliant on your postcode, primarily in London or Leeds, where their 2 centres exist. And I've accessed that myself, but that's akin to the kind of counselling support you get when you access your records. So it's really not therapeutically informed and trauma informed in that sense. Myself, I've been down the NHS pathway, and again, that was over a period of 30 years of accessing, trying to access help. My GP initially prescribes me antidepressants and tells me that I'm just suffering with depression and just trying to move on with life. But as Sally rightly said, it's a severance for us, and it's living with trauma, and that not being recognised on the NHS as trauma itself. And being sent for CBT therapy is not an option for us, because we can't just flick the switch and change the way we think about things. In 2021, when I was diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder as a direct result of my adoption, I then had to wait 18 months for trauma therapy, which was 20 sessions, and I was kind of left after those 20 sessions. So, non-existent pretty much.
To Jess.
Based on your organisation's experiences, what factors most commonly influence whether reunions between adoptees and birth relatives are positive, difficult or unsuccessful? And what support do you think is needed to help people feel safe and well supported during contact and reunion? We've heard a little bit already about that, but does anyone want to add any more? Sally?
Yes, thank you. So I suppose the 2 things that make tracing positive are actually really straightforward. One is practical help with finding the right information, and the other thing is emotional support that recognises how frightening tracing and reunion can actually be for adult adoptees when we've grown up being told unfit mother, didn't want you. It's a really scary thing to go and do, to put yourself out there. And what makes it difficult is equally clear. So it's the no emotional support, record access being blocked, state support that is available is restricted and limited. So there's no statutory requirement for a local council to provide you with support. So you might go and they say, this is what's happened to me, this is my experience. I've gone to my local council and they say, we haven't got any money, sorry, can't help you. PAC UK doesn't at the moment meet national demand. That's not their fault, they just haven't got the funding for it. I think they've had a trial amount of money to try to do it, but they've got a massive waiting list of people now wanting to access that support. Private services are often unsafe and they're financially exploitative, so they're often linked to the perpetrators of forced adoption, and I think you saw some of that at the last hearing. Or they're private services and they're prohibitively expensive, and they're profiteering. I paid an intermediary service over £1,000 to write a 3-sentence letter to my brother, who was separately placed for adoption, and that was it. And all they would write and say was that I was looking for him. They said they could include one bit of information, which was what food did I like and dislike, and that I was requesting contact if he was interested, and and that was £1,000. There are no tracing or intermediary services for transnational adoptees, and Debbie can speak very powerfully for that, but there is nothing for transnational adoptees, either tracing or intermediary. We've talked. I think we've talked about the improvements that could be made, but if we haven't, we can talk about that.
So as an inter-country adoptee, there is absolutely no provision of tracing birth parents for me whatsoever, which I find utterly appalling. You ask for tracing help and you're told, sorry, we don't get involved. We can't do anything for you. There is a inter-country adoption centre here that exists in the UK, one of 2 inter-country adoption centres, and I've repeatedly asked them to help me trace my birth family, but they refuse to. And I don't understand why their international adoption exists if you're not going to help those children who then grow into adults and want to search for their parents across boundaries and borders with no help, no governmental support, no bureaucratic support whatsoever. We're really left to our own devices. It's taken me a period of 40 years to find both my birth parents. I was too late in finding my birth father. He'd already passed away, and I had to use DNA to trace him, and it took me 7 years to eventually locate him. Nobody helped me in that process. Not one person offered. Oh yes, sorry, one person did offer, and she was a social worker who was in private practice and wanted to charge me £2,000. At the time, I didn't have that kind of money.
Well, my son found out he was adopted when he was 27, and he found out by accident. The next day, he went to Swansea Social Services and was just handed the file. I'm supposed to be 5'10", by the way, which would help me immensely if I was. But the reality is, within a week, he was knocking on my front door. I had no preparation for this, neither did he. He is a very bright young man and knew how to get around things. It was 1995, so there was no emails or anything like that you could do. So we wrote to the address that was given and questioned, does anybody know where Anne is? Because I think I might be related to her. And within days, he was knocking at my door. So I didn't have any counselling, any preparation, anything. But it was the biggest, loveliest surprise. I felt I'd won the lottery. So and we're very close and very friends ever since. It caused huge problems because he didn't want to be with his adopted mum, and I had to encourage that. It answered, in his words, more questions than it raised, because he couldn't work out why his father didn't want to know him, because his mother and father got divorced when he was 3. His mother then went on to have 4 other marriages, but he was trying very hard to keep a relationship with his father. And of course, it wasn't his father, but his father didn't manage it very well. It created chaos all around. And but it's better today, and it's fine today. And so that is a pleasing ending to what was a harrowing story. But we're just good friends now, and always will be.
I think the problem with reunion is that people assume it'll be a happy ever after. You've got TV programs like Long Lost Family who give you the impression that once there's a reunion, then it's all pretty and everybody holds hands and skips off into the sunset. And it is so difficult. Generally speaking, I haven't spoken to people who have had support. I didn't have support. Anne hasn't had support. I've spoken to a lot of people. I've had a lot of emails from people saying, how do I cope? The difficulty with reunion is that you've got strangers who should know each other. You have all the assumptions, expectations, presumptions, all the stories people have been told, all the lies people have been told, and all the stuff that people bring into that meeting. And there is nothing to support anyone through that. There is nothing that I have found or anyone else has found that is useful without shelling out a lot of money for someone who doesn't really care. And the trouble with all of this is that people think they know. We need adoption-informed support. We need people to understand that women who've had children ripped from their arms or taken from them without them even knowing, and they go back and they find they're gone. People who've gone through that, they don't recover. Children who've been taken don't recover as adults and miraculously become not adopted. It doesn't happen. So everybody goes into this with a level of trauma and injury and suffering that is yet to be acknowledged often prior to the reunion and during the reunion, and they find out how damaged they are. They find out how much they're bringing to this, which they really don't need, but it's a lot of baggage. So in terms of support through reunion, I think people need to be guided, held, supported by anyone who understands how difficult, how painful, and how precarious it is, because it's like walking on eggshells. You meet this person, you make assumptions about them, or they make assumptions about you. You could put one foot wrong, say the wrong word, and the whole thing will collapse like a house of cards. And we're all terrified that that will happen, because reunion is, as Anne said, the most precious thing. You really want this. You really want the other person, the person who's been taken from you, you want them back in your life. And in some cases, people are willing to pay any price to have that person in their life. But it's not a supportive process. It's not something where people have any help. And it often breaks down. Yeah. And the heartbreak that follows is even worse, because it's the same trauma again. It's the same loss again, but it becomes irrevocable. There's no way back from that, often. Sometimes people will, build bridges, but the relationship will never be what it could have been anyway. So the right help to get people to build something that will last is vital, absolutely vital. And there is some research that was published recently, which was born of this difficulty. And this person, her daughter was taken, she reunited, it all went very well, and then when it started going wrong, she thought, I'll look at the research, because she's an academic. And when she did, she found there isn't any, and this is one of the many things we're asking for is research. She put together this research and she published very recently, and I'm sure either I or somebody from AAM can send you a copy. It's so heartbreakingly powerful when you see how damaged people are, and the way it shortens people's lifespans, and that reunion is this precarious thing, that if you manage to navigate through all the difficulty and all the roller coaster emotions, and you get to the end and you think, I've got something, it's still not what you would have had. So it's very difficult.
And I'm going to go to Chris for our final question now.
And look, thank you all of you for coming. It's been a incredibly powerful session, I think we'd all agree. Just in closing, really, and I think, Anne, you kind of touched upon this, but is there anything you would like this committee to take forward and put to government with regards today's discussion? And open up to anyone, but if I start with, I'll go across Diana, go across then, if that's all right.
I think that what's been said here and what's been sent in by way of documentation, and I think we've all, contributed evidence, suggestions, ideas, lists. All of that really needs to go forward. So we would like to bring this to a close.
Yes.
Yeah.
We would like to move on with our lives and not have to revisit and relive all of this again and again and again. I think I'll just stop there, because that's it.
I agree. Let's get it done.
Yeah, I echo that, absolutely. We'd just like something. We'd like there to be some action. We'd like the apology for our own dignity and to help us move on with our lives, and to not have to keep explaining to people that we don't have to be grateful. So we'd like that, and we'd really, really like the mitigations. So we'd really like the trauma-informed physical and mental health support. We'd really like help with tracing and reunion. We'd really like improved access to records. And there's two other things that the community would like as well. So I think it's been mentioned, there's independent and meaningful representation of adult adoptees, and also research. So we're very mindful that policymakers and practitioners, and this includes the DfE, Adoption England, the regional adoption agencies, NHS, MPs, parliamentary groups, including their secretariats, should be required to give adoptee-led organisations a lead role in improving and developing adoption policy and practice. I think there's so many reports out saying adoption is failing and has failed, and we have knowledge that could help with that, but we are gate-kept from that. We have asked for that, and we are kept out. And research is essential, because adoption, again, it's going back to this, it has failed, and there's so many reports about how it's failing now. So we would ask for 4 things. One, that the government commissions research on lifelong adult adoptee outcomes, physical and mental health outcomes, addiction, mortality and abuse in adoptive families, because unless you know what's actually happening, how can you do it better? And B, we'd ask that there's an adoptee marker created on NHS records to enable research. We'd also ask that NICE guidance is developed on screening and supporting people who have little or no family medical history. And we'd ask that adoption separation is recognised as an adverse childhood experience.
I'd like to echo everything Sally's already said, and I'd like to add that for too long our voices have been suppressed and that we've been infantilised. And it's really from the moment of birth for us, our voices haven't been taken into account, and our lived experience hasn't been taken into account, and the lifelong consequences of not knowing our biological relations and not knowing our own medical history have had consequences not only for us, but they continue on to our children and the next generation. And so thank you for hearing our voices today and including us in this.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. It wouldn't be the right thing for the Chair to preempt the discussion and deliberations of the Select Committee, but I think I can say on behalf of everybody that listening to your evidence this morning has been incredibly compelling and very moving for members of the committee, and I think it is impossible to listen to what you've said today and not to conclude that things need to change, and the evidence that you've given to us today will inform our recommendations to the government. We will seek to put your voices at the heart of what we say. Thank you once again. I want to just reiterate our gratitude to you for once again reliving such traumatic and difficult experiences, and we will do our best to make sure that there is a limitation on the extent to which you need to do that again in the future. Thank you. Order. Welcome back to the session of the Education Select Committee on Historical Forced Adoptions, and the second half of our session will be questioning the Minister and his official Josh MacAlister, would you like to introduce yourself and make any opening statements and introduce your official as well? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Select Committee for taking evidence on this and for the session, and particular thanks to Debbie, Sally and Diana for really powerful experiences that they've shared, not just today but previously as well. I'm Josh MacAlister, I'm the Minister for Children and Families. Happy to introduce Gila and then I'll do.
Hi, and I'm Gila Sachs, Director General for Families in the Department for Education, and echo the Minister's thanks.
Thank you very much. So the committee has heard overwhelming evidence that for decades unmarried mothers were routinely shamed, pressured, misinformed and coerced, and that their children were removed from them and placed for adoption. Does the government accept that these women did not in reality have any choice at all about the adoption of their babies?
Yes. And there's a few things I'd like to share in terms of the government's position on this, which differs from the previous government's position on this issue. The first thing to say is that I wholly agree with you as Chair, and I believe you're speaking for the committee when you say that there is unfinished business on this issue. I and the government completely agree that there is. The first thing to stress is that I personally and the government shares an understanding of the cause and the case being made by campaigners, both adoptees and also those women who had their children forcibly removed from them, and want to pay a huge thank you to those individuals who've come forward, set up campaign groups and advocated for an apology and for change on this issue. Having done that, I believe they have already started a process which certainly needs to speed up, of allowing many thousands of people who have never had never been able to share what happened to them many decades ago, and in knowing that there are others out there and that there is peer support and that this is something that can be spoken about publicly, I believe that is changing lives for many people. They should not need to keep making the case that they are. I've read back through evidence that was given to the Joint Committee and previous Education Select Committee, witnesses having given very similar stories, and listened to stories in the media where many of these women and adoptees are having to repeat their story time and time again. Secondly, the government acknowledges that the state had a role in this, and that it is not good enough to describe what happened simply as a result of actions of society. There is a strong relationship between social attitudes to women at the time that this occurred, and the role that the state and other actors, including the church and religious institutions, played, and there was a symbiotic relationship. But that in no way takes away from the fact that there was aspects of the machine of the state which enabled and sustained a practice that went on for decades, forcibly removing children from these women in homes that were sometimes run by the state, enabled and overseen by social workers employed by the state, and social attitudes that were reinforced by practices that carried on for many years. So I completely accept that the state had a role in this. And thirdly, regarding the question of an apology, this is something that the previous government said it regretted. It apologised on behalf of society. I understand the campaigners' case for a formal, official government apology, and that is something that is being actively considered as of now by the government. To do that, it needs to be done with the level of gravity and by someone senior in government to reflect the gravity of what happened. It wouldn't be the time and place to do it. I would not be the right person to offer that apology on behalf of the government. And if we were to do that apology, it would need to be done worked up in close collaboration with the campaign groups who you've heard from today and others to ensure that it is comprehensive, that it lifts, in a meaningful way, lifts the shame and stigma that far too many people have been living with for far too long. So I do, in answering the question, accept that the state had a role. It's important that we are honest about that. The case for an apology is powerful, and it is something that the government is actively considering. And the final thing to say is that there is an urgency to this as well. There are people who are at the end of their life, who have lived with the stigma of this, and it is very important that we move quickly to actively consider this case and make a decision.
Thank you. Are you able to put a timescale on the government's work in this area?
I can't put a timescale on it, but as I say, this is urgent. I recognise that this is not something we can take a long time over, and the campaigners have been making the case for this for many years.
And we've heard, including today, about the lifelong consequences for adoptees of the severance that they experienced, the trauma that they went through, and the issues that leaves many still living with today. Do you acknowledge the need for genuine practical assistance along the range of, I won't reiterate the evidence that we've had today, which is really clear from adult adoptees that they need help and support as part of any process of apology to make a meaningful difference in their lives today?
I do recognise that, and in many respects we don't need to wait for the decision on the apology to start actioning some of those points. Since the Joint Committee's report and recommendations, some actions have been taken forward by the previous government and by this government. There are 3 things which are worth updating the committee on regarding action. The first is about mental health and trauma support, which your witnesses mentioned. My department and I have been working with the Department of Health and Social Care and NHS England. Next month, we will be sending out details to GPs, recommending that pathways are there for people who have survived through this awful experience historically and are still living with the consequences of it today. That is important because what we've heard from many adult adoptees and birth parents is that even when they interact with the NHS, it's not always clear to practitioners in the NHS that this is something that does need to be recognised, that this was a systematic case of abuse of many people, and that there are and should be pathways for those women and adult adoptees to be supported through. And secondly, in regard to the availability of counselling and other mental health support, we have removed the Ofsted registration requirement, which was a recommendation from the Joint Committee, and that in part is to make sure that there is enough supply of therapeutic and counselling services available. Secondly, it is really important that we support people with accessing records, and intermediary services are there. From the 4 witnesses that you had before me, that was obviously an issue that has been a problem for many years. Family Connect was set up as an intermediary service funded by government a few years ago. We are substantially increasing the funding available to Family Connect. It has already supported about 1,000 birth parents and adult adoptees. We want to see that extended much more, and there are particular groups who we haven't seen as many people come forward from. So, for example, birth parents who are in their later years, so would have had a forced adoption earlier on when it was allowed by the state. And then thirdly, yesterday, Quorum Bath and the Archives and Record Association announced the creation of a freely accessible national online resource showing where adoption and care records are held across the UK. This is important because it's not entirely clear to many where their adoption records may be. It's not the case that they will be with the organisation that was responsible for the adoption, because that organisation may no longer be around. And as some of your witnesses shared, those records may have moved many times between different organisations. That will be available by the end of this year. I'm working with the Archives and Records Association on supporting the preservation of records, and in encouraging local authorities, and I'll write out to them soon to ensure that they meet my expectation that that platform is used and that they participate fully in it. And then finally, we will consult on changes to adoption record retention periods to extend that period to protect them. And there are also issues about digitisation and making sure that that process does not result in the destruction of adoption records.
And can you confirm, so you talked about a process that the government is in with regard to consideration of an apology and what that might look like, and a process of collaboration with those with lived experience to make sure that that process is properly undertaken. I can see when you were talking about some of the measures that are already underway, a degree of concern from some of the people with lived experience in the public gallery about resourcing and some of those measures. Can you confirm that this is a genuine ongoing dialogue, and that the government will work to make sure that those measures are fit for purpose as it continues to progress this work?
Yes, and when you look at the apologies that have been offered by the Scottish, Welsh governments, by the Australian government, and look at the support that's been provided alongside them, we of course have looked pretty closely at those, as did the Joint Committee, and we want to make sure that the next steps are not just about statements, but also ensuring that we respond fully to the concerns and experiences that people have got now. And some of the actions that we're taking here are equivalent to actions that have been taken by other jurisdictions. And the increase in funding, as I say, Family Connect has already reached 1,000 individuals. We want to see that go much further in the intermediary support that's made available, and we are substantially increasing the funding available for that, which I'm pleased to share with you today.
Thank you very much. And then I just want to ask about the your understanding of the reach of this practice. So we have heard today from two of the groups at the very core of the impact of the practice of historical forced adoptions, mothers who had their babies forcibly removed from them, and adult adoptees who are suffering the lifelong impacts of the trauma that they experienced. But we've also had evidence that the network of trauma and consequence from this practice extends very widely. So we've heard, for example, from mothers who were in mother and baby homes who experienced that cruelty and stigma and shame, but who were able to keep their babies, but who nevertheless lived with some consequences from that traumatic experience. We know that not all by any stretch, but some fathers would have wanted to play a role in their child's lives and were denied that opportunity. We know that there were other relatives, grandparents, kinship carers. This had a community-wide impact. And I just want to explore for a moment the government's understanding of that and where it sits with you in terms of the scope of the apology that you may be considering.
Well, look, the first thing to say is the priority, I think, needs to be on those most immediately affected as adult adoptees and the women who had babies forcibly removed from them and the harrowing experiences of those women. But the thing that is so troubling about the history of this is the degree to which, as you've described, it was sustained by really troubling social attitudes about women, particularly teenage girls, and the the shame that families would feel at having a young daughter who got pregnant out of marriage, and the mixture of emotions that many of those parents, and you're right to highlight them, may now feel the guilt, they may now feel for the views and attitudes that they held. The staff who worked in these institutions, many of whom would have joined their vocation having never intended to cause harm in the way that they would have done as part of those institutions, and dismantling that system is not a one-off event. And I recognise, again, from some of your witnesses, the belief that this carried on beyond 1976 when the Act was passed, because some of these were deeply held views in practice, not simply in law.
You've already set out that the government is actively looking at an apology, that you're committed to co-creating that with those with lived experience. I just wanted to ask specifically about how that period of co-creation might work. Are you, for example, committing to a formal consultation or a co-authoring model? How will that process work, and how will organisations and those with lived experience genuinely contribute?
So I'm not in a position to set out the details of how that would work, but I am very confident to give the commitment that we will do that with those who've been affected by it. The model of government apologies when they've been effective is that they have fully involved those who were on the receiving end of state injustice, and it's important in this case that the same is the case. I should also add that the Secretary of State cares hugely about this issue. She's met both groups that you've heard from today. Had this session been next week, I know she would have been very keen to be here. So please don't take the appearance of a junior minister as anything other than availability. But I know that Bridget cares hugely about this and wants to make sure that as this is actively considered, we do it in the right way, and that means making sure that those who've got direct experience of this harm are at the table.
And I think that the reason why that is so important is because we've heard over the course of taking evidence on this that an apology alone isn't enough, that apologies given when there is no follow-up action are almost in some ways worse. We took, in our last evidence session, evidence from an organisation who had nominally apologised for their role in this, only for the witness in front of the committee, I think, to say some very concerning things. And that is why it is so important that it is not just an apology, it's the right apology in the right way, supported by the right actions.
I completely agree. I mean, look, saying sorry and not meaning it is almost worse than a position of regret. And I read that same evidence that you're referring to and can absolutely understand why the words, the meaning of this would need to be very, very carefully pulled together.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Minister. You touched upon, obviously, some formal apologies from other countries, and, you know, specifically Australia, we know about, and Northern Ireland. Obviously, as we look, and what was important about those apologies, as we've kind of touched upon, it wasn't just an apology, but it was backed up with, you know, funded support and long-term support for those people who've been affected. And, you know, that's been mentioned by in the previous panel about what that might look like. But I wondered what lessons or what assessment the government has done about what other countries have done as a response to their formal apology, and what lessons that you've learned for your own responses, potential response.
Yeah, I mean, closer to home, the Scottish and Welsh government apologies came with announcements of support which are not dissimilar to the approach that's currently being taken here in England by the UK government. The Australian apology came with resources to also provide support for peer support groups, which, having spoken to parents who had their children forcibly removed, I know is something that can be a hugely liberating experience to meet one another and share those experiences. we are able with Family Connect to extend that support because of the extra funding that we're putting into it. I don't think there is a magic bullet to this, and the evidence that you've heard, the recommendations from the Joint Committee, the policy suggestions from campaigners extend across a whole range of issues, from record keeping through to intermediary support and reunification or reconnection, through to mental health support and support with trauma, as well as, and this is where I understand the case that's being made for a formal government apology, as well as the shifting and lifting of attitudes in society about what happened, and a sort of shared collective experience of recognising that.
Just a follow-up. I mean, obviously you were here for the previous panel, and a lot of it was very emotional and quite shocking. I found one of the most shocking things was just the way that the panel are still being treated by professionals. You know, talk about getting. I know we're going to talk about record keeping in a moment, but getting their files, the fact that they weren't allowed their files, or their files were heavily redacted. But it was also the way that they were spoken to. It was suggested that they were still being spoken to like they were children. I mean, that's completely unacceptable. Would you agree, Minister? And that isn't about a formal apology. That isn't about spending money. That's something that can be fixed really, really quickly just by a change in attitude and a change in culture for those people that are employed in those organisations. So is that something that the department can really look at and push very, very quickly?
It is, and I agree, and it's also not limited to historical experiences of the adoption process. It's also, to be candid, an issue that children's social care still has with how it functions much of the time. It wields enormous power over families, often, in important occasions, justifiably so, where there's significant harm to a child. But there are far too many experiences of families, and I've heard very many recent experiences that parents and relatives have had, where the power imbalance, the experience of having social work involvement and some of the decisions that are made in the family court process can be hugely dehumanising for individuals. And I mean, you said, Chris, it's it can be as easy as culture change. In a way, that's the harder bit, but we have a huge amount of work underway on that front. That was one of the leading recommendations from my own independent review of children's social care 4 years ago, and that is a big part of the £2.4 billion that we're putting into the Families First programme to shift the attitude to families and the importance of family networks for helping children grow up successfully.
Bring in Caroline.
Thank you, Minister. You talked about the government having a role in this process. We've heard about who was to blame for it. Some people have talked about the families of the women, they've talked about society, wider societal views, the organisations involved in the adoption, and others. You've talked about the government. Do you think the government had a large role to play or a relatively small role to play in this process?
Well, let me start by saying that the people that certainly should have no shame or stigma on them and were not responsible were the women and babies involved. You can look at this in a number of ways. The proportion of these mother and baby homes that were run by different institutions tells one story, and there were a very large proportion run by religious institutions. But of course, there was no clear segmentation of state, church, or social attitude, and they all contributed to one another to create a set of circumstances that allowed this to continue for decades and allowed it to be created in the first place. I mean, the fact that local authorities had moral welfare officers, as Anne referred to earlier, really speaks to the point. And NHS services as well were a part of it. I'm not sure there's much value in me trying to attribute a proportion of the responsibility, rather to say that the state was a part of sustaining this, and through its laws and through arms of the state, courts, social workers, and health services, it reinforced and sustained that machine. and previously governments have not acknowledged that. So
I would point to the evidence that the committee has previously received from academic witnesses who would highlight the flows of funding as well from the state into many of the institutions that were at the core of these practices, and that will form part of the evidence that we consider in our deliberations. Caroline.
Thank you. So one of the things we've heard about this morning is about the follow-up actions that need to take place as well as an apology. So I'd just like to talk to you about adoption records. Now, you have said that there's going to be a free online resource showing where adoption records are held by the end of this year.
Yeah.
That doesn't actually suggest that the process for accessing the adoption records in the place where they are held will be made any easier, and Debbie gave some very powerful testimony about the awful process she has had to go through. So I'd just like to ask you a couple of things. Do you think it's acceptable that people have to wait months, if not years, to get access to records? And then when they do get access to their records, that most of the records have been redacted because somebody somewhere has made a decision that that person does not have the right to see information about their own history? And what can the government do to change this? Because nobody has more right than an adoptee to know where they come from. And it shouldn't be up to somebody in an office to decide that they can't access that information.
Yeah. Well, there is significant variation across the country at the moment in the amount of time it takes for different people coming forward to get their records, to get a response. And there are cases where it's 18 months or longer, and that's unacceptable. The government issued last year pretty extensive guidance with expectations about how records should be kept and shared. The challenge is still there with the variation. So in how we've thought about this, we've spoken to the Archive and Records Association to seek their advice on the possibility of a wholly centralised system. The advice from them is that this would be pretty difficult to coordinate, and even after the huge amount of work that would need to go into establishing it, which would not be quick or easy, and it would cost a lot of money as well. And there are choices here about where money could go in helping people access records. Many of them have been destroyed, and so the way that we've tried to approach this is the Core and Bath online platform helps identify where records are kept when that is launched later on this year. That's a significant step forward, and the resourcing that we're putting into Family Connect as a service will mean that there is much more available resource there for the intermediary services to help people navigate those, establish who it is they need to speak to, make sure that they've got the conversation set up, and then have support after that initial conversation. But I am very happy personally to follow up with particular outlier local authorities or services where those periods of time are taking a lot longer than they should. And I am also, in terms of redaction, there of course is a need for redaction sometimes with these records because of other people's personal information. But I have heard, not just today, but from more recent experiences of adoption and care, where a child's been taken into care, that the redaction process can be so extensive as to make the records themselves useless in terms of what they tell as a story of what happened, and what records were kept of decisions that were being made. So I'm happy to be more proactive with local authorities on this. The combination that we've got at the moment of this new digital platform, which Core and Bath have led on, and I'm very grateful to them for doing that. The expansion of Family Connect, the guidance that we've got, and then the willingness from me in the department to be proactive in following up with particular local authorities and services should mean that we get some improvement in this space.
Are you working with the adult adoptee children in this process to be guided by what they need?
I'm very happy to meet with them and to work with them on that and all the issues.
I'm looking at the reactions behind you, and
unfortunately I can't see
my hunch
directions.
is that what you're saying is perhaps not exactly what they're looking for. So could you commit to having a meeting with Sally and her colleagues to guide you through this process and how they would like it to be done?
Very happy to.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Minister, clearly it's really important that the organisations that are supplying the information and the support around these survivors are trusted and independent. And I think it's just important, perhaps to get your reflections on that. And secondly, what we heard from testimony is that there's already a UK and Ireland records database, and the survivors said that they just need a little bit of extra help. Is there a reason why what they've brought together hasn't been considered by the department in terms of getting this all going?
There isn't at the moment a record which has tracked down where the records have ended up. So there will be nuns who worked in a religious institution that were involved in these adoptions that have then folded, no longer exist, and another organisation will have retained those records, we hope. In some cases they have been destroyed, and there is no national picture of where those are at the moment. So that's the issue which we're hoping this core and BAF work this year will address in identifying where they have ended up. The other question that you asked me, which was...
It was pointing to what we've literally just heard about there being a UK and Ireland records database. So I guess if that's not something that you've heard of, Minister, but it would be useful for the organisation to follow up with you afterwards.
It doesn't serve that purpose, which is why so many people looking for their records at the moment are being bounced from pillar to post between different organisations trying to establish where their records may be. So that service does not exist. I don't know what that organisation or database provides, but it is not this function. This is new. And Jess, sorry, you asked me something before.
It's about the independence, the organisation providing the records.
So it is important in terms of intermediary services that there is no expectation that people get support from an organisation that they see as having had a role in the abuse itself. There are a number of intermediary services that are inspected and rated by Ofsted. I could understand why for some individuals they wouldn't want to go to the organisation that was part of their story earlier on in life. So the choice is there, and in Family Connect we've been really careful to make sure that that is a service that can be built as a kind of national front door for some of this that doesn't have those historical ties.
Thank you. Minister, do you think there is a necessity potentially, and is there a willingness from government to legislate, if required, to preserve adoption records and ensure that record holding bodies are subject to consistent duties and oversights? I appreciate what you're saying about, in some cases, these record holders have changed because of those organisations are not existing. But is that do we need to do something legally to make sure that these records can't be destroyed or forgotten?
Yes. I think we do. We're open to doing that and doing it this year. There would need to be a consultation. This would involve a change of regulations, so there would need to be a consultation on the time we expect services to keep their records for. It's currently 75 years. We're looking at should that be extended to 100 years, and you raised some other important questions in that as well.
And just on, I suppose the point about independence. So we have had evidence that would perhaps point to the fact that the number of fires and floods that people seeking their records are told have taken place might not entirely match the number of actual instances of fire and flood everywhere in the country, and that I suppose that people seeking their records may simply be given an excuse. Nobody knows where their records are. The easiest thing is to say that they don't exist. So in seeking to ensure both that the organisation that anybody seeking their records has to go to is an independent organisation, not an organisation associated with past trauma and past decision making, but also that there are sufficient duties on that organisation to really get to the bottom of the question of where records are, who holds records, and that nobody can be brushed off with a line that their records don't exist unless someone's thoroughly got to the bottom of that and concluded that that is indeed the case.
Yeah, I mean, these issues should be being addressed through the clarity that's been provided through, again, the really extensive guidance that was published last year, which was in response to the Joint Committee's recommendations in relation to this particular area. I am very happy to, if there's evidence the committee's got, take a look at that myself and follow up with any services or agencies. I think it's probably worth us speaking to Family Connect as well about whether they have particular patterns they're seeing in trying to support individuals with particular services or organisations keeping records where it's far more difficult. And again, I'm happy to be more proactive on that front.
And again, I mean, the opportunity presented by the new Aaron Cornbath platform will allow that transparency. So because we will then be able to see where things are and what is there, the ability to then safeguard that, ensure that it's being maintained and properly accessed will be much improved. It's all step by step. It's very, very difficult to prove that something wasn't destroyed for obvious reasons, and that's a terrible position to be in, but it is the reality of it. So what we need to absolutely focus on is making sure that the records that exist are as kind of clearly and systematically recorded and mapped, and that the journey from an individual to accessing them is as smooth as possible. And again, that's really what a lot of the increased funding that the Minister has referred to is really about, so that the burden of that journey is less on them and they get more support through that process.
We have heard that mothers and adoptees are frequently placed on generic NHS pathways that do not recognise adoption-related trauma, leading to misdiagnosis, delayed treatment, and in some cases further trauma, as we've heard today. How will the government ensure that NHS services develop the expertise needed to identify and respond appropriately to adoption-related trauma?
There are wider issues about the overall capacity of the NHS to provide mental health services and support at the moment. The government over the next few years is boosting the number of practitioners to deliver mental health support by 8,000. And mental health support teams will help with that. We are next month, as I mentioned earlier on, with NHS England writing to GPs to highlight the importance of this group and their needs, given the historical nature of what happened and the fact that there are still so many experiences that they've carried with them through to today, and that the NHS needs to see and recognise that and make sure that they get the mental health support that they need. I have, not me personally, but Bridget, as Secretary of State, has heard from adult adoptees that when that works, the support can be really powerful and is what's needed. So it's important that we make sure overall the resources are there, not just for this group but for many people who need support with mental health services, that the first point of contact in the NHS is aware of the needs of this particular group, and we are taking some action on that in the next few weeks. I don't know whether...
Maybe just to add that there is work going on much more broadly between our department and NHS England on the kind of range of associated needs and trauma, because we're conscious that, I mean, as has been touched on, the impacts could go very wide, both of the historic adoption we're discussing, but also the range of kind of current needs of those impacted, those in or around the care system. And so, as the Minister has said, there is a balance both of extending kind of bespoke and particular pathways, but also of simply increasing awareness across many, many different parts of the NHS outside of core mental health professionals to ensure that there is much greater sensitivity and speed of access to the most appropriate pathways for those experiencing related trauma today and in the past.
Thank you for that. Isn't the problem, though, that as we've heard, that there isn't a trauma-informed pathway, and that actually there are very, very few counselling services which themselves recognise trauma due to adoption? And isn't there a concern that in quite rightly raising awareness amongst NHS professionals, all you'll be doing is then taking those who've experienced trauma down a pathway that could further damage them if they're forced, for example, onto something like a CBT course that we heard about, which isn't appropriate, isn't there to address their trauma, can actually make them feel worse about their shame. Isn't there a concern that we need to make sure that there's an actual pathway with provision specifically for these groups?
So, I mean, look, specifically for this group that we're talking about, the recognition in services does matter, and to provide a bit of challenge back, Jess, I think it is for clinicians to look at NICE guidelines and clinical advice over the most appropriate response and interventions, and I wouldn't want to kind of stumble into suggesting what those might be as a politician, and I think it is a right and appropriate that the clinical guidance is there and that that's followed. This is in a context where mental health services in this country are on their knees, and the government is really clear about that. That has ramifications across every area of responsibility I have as a minister, and there is not a day that doesn't go by where I have a request, a very reasonable request, for support for current adoptees, kinship carers, foster carers, birth parents, children in residential care, and you could repeat that over and over again in every corner of government because of the position that our mental health services have been left in. Recovering that will take a bit of time, but the government is investing in mental health services. It is boosting the number of people that are providing it, and we are taking steps in the DfE with NHS England on the pathways that GPs can support people who've experienced this awful abuse through, and recognising that they are a population that needs support.
Thank you, Chair. So previous witnesses and survivors today in the previous panel has told us that there is significant variation in the quality and consistency of intermediary services, and this has a real impact on reunions, sometimes with distressing outcomes. And the movement for an adoption apology has called for a fully funded intermediary service to assist with making and sustaining contact. So, Minister, how will you effectively improve the standards of these services?
So we looked at the Joint Committee's report on this as well, and particular issues around complaints, and we followed up with some of the intermediary services about that. The government followed up pretty soon after the Joint Committee's report. The availability of intermediary services and the funding for it is something that we recognise does need to be greater. That's why we're putting extra money into intermediary services. So that is a decision that's been made, and I'm pleased to share with the committee today to make sure that the resources are there to meet a higher need. When it works, I've heard how impactful it can be, and as I say, if I was coming to you today saying it's all fine and the resources are there to deliver what's expected from people, I think you'd reasonably give me a hard time about it. We recognise that it needs to improve, and that's why we've put additional resource into it.
So finally, Minister, we've heard today, I think from you, a real commitment to move this agenda forward. We've heard a commitment to work with those with lived experience to move this forward. And we've also heard about some things that government is trying to do quickly to improve the situation. And I think we've heard about a little bit of a kind of mismatch between those two things, that perhaps some of the things that the government is trying to do with good intentions haven't quite reflected that spirit of collaboration and partnership working that you have acknowledged are necessary for moving this issue on towards a meaningful and impactful apology with a set of mitigating measures. So I just want to ask finally, when you think government will be in a position to set out a clear process and timescale to working with the community that are most directly affected by these horrendous practices, so that the witnesses that we've heard from today and many others who have comparable experiences and stories to tell can start to feel that they don't have to keep retelling and reliving their experiences in order to get towards a commitment for an apology, but because we are genuinely on a journey to get to an actual apology.
Yeah. The fact that the government is actively considering it, I put the emphasis on the word active. It is a live conversation at the moment. I can't give the committee a timetable for it, but I know it is urgent, and I know that many of the stories that you've heard today from those who've been directly affected by this awful abuse have had to tell those stories many, many times. I don't want them to have to do that anymore, and we will move as fast as we can. I think, if I may, your reflection on my evidence is a demonstration of the tension between doing things right and engaging people fully and the desire people have rightly to move quickly. If the government were to offer an apology very quickly and not engage with people, I think quite reasonably people would have would be disappointed in how it had been handled. And so it's important for the government to recognise the importance of this, and I think we do. We do want to move quickly because of the age of the people, many of the people who've been affected by this, and frankly, looking back at government's positions on this over recent years, they simply haven't been good enough in reflection of the scale of what happened, the role the state played, and the huge damage it's had on tens of thousands of lives.
Thank you very much indeed. I just want to explain for the members of the public who in the gallery might be watching online what our process is from here. So this is the final one of our evidence sessions in public. The committee will now deliberate, not today, but in the near future, on all of the evidence that we've heard during this inquiry, and we will make our recommendations formally in a report to the government. We will also be working quickly to do that, acknowledging everything that we've heard about the urgency of these issues today. And I'll end just by thanking once again the Minister and Gila Sachs for being here with us today. Thank you for listening to the evidence earlier in the day as well. And most of all, thank you very much to the witnesses who shared their stories with us earlier today. That brings our evidence session for today to a close. Order, order.